I finished reading The Farm by Joanne Ramos. Which was amazing. It was amazing. It was a book that I picked up a couple of months ago. I think it was the first time I'd gone to the library here to get my library card. And I like to find library books by perusing. And so it was one that I just found when I was looking around. I was intrigued. And it's the last one that I read in the 6 books or something that I got on that library trip. And I've had it for so long that I was almost because it's been rechecked out a bunch of times. It's been 2 or 3 months. And it was the last one in my set of books. And I was kind of do I read? I've got more coming in, and I picked up some more. And so I'm is it worth it to read? Maybe I'll just return it. And then I looked at the cover again, and I was no, this does look interesting. Because it's a, sort of dystopian, deals with sort of systemic controls and autonomy, and especially around women's rights and pregnancy and motherhood, which are all just themes that I find really interesting. So I was no, I'll just read it. So I started it 3 days ago, and I got through I sat through reading for an hour, which I feel it's more, I have a harder and harder time doing that I read more and more in short increments of 10, 20, 30 minutes rather than sitting and reading for an hour or two. I don't know if that's an attention span or just that I don't like sitting that long. So I read for an hour. I was immediately drawn in. And part of that was that it starts so much differently than I had anticipated, because the inner flap is here's the opportunity to get everything that you could ever want, and all you have to do is be tracked for 9 months. It's a much more attention grabbing kind of inner panel. And then the first few chapters are just kind of centered around Jane and her life and her, being this just kind of young woman who's trying to get her shit together, and she has 8 who's kind of trying to help her out, and 8 seems to have her shit together, and and it's this old woman and their relationship, and her being out of a job, and 8 getting sick, and she's you need to do this job, and all these questions of money. And I think what drew me in so quickly was her ability to just build tension. It wasn't what I mean, it was suspenseful. She had immediately, I think, one, that these characters are so well written, and it's written in the I don't know what the name is for it, but where it's different perspectives for each chapter. How Rick Riordan does it, that's my context. And I think it was so effective for a few reasons. I think that it gives us insight into very different characters with very different frames of mind. Not only different experiences, but different ways of thinking, different ways of behaving, and the way that she articulates that and creates such clarity with Jane, with 8, with Reagan, with May, that they are all such distinct individuals, and that feel very human. They don't feel like caricatures. Here's the poor one, here's the old one, here's the rich one. They feel immediately these really complex, nuanced characters that have very clear points of view, and that are very clearly imperfect in creating a lot of space for how they kind of develop throughout the book. And I think also that this being a book, where ultimately a lot of it feels like it kind of centers on this question of surveillance and control and autonomy, and who gets to have autonomy and within what means, and how does money influence autonomy or even just like provide it, like that it provides, and it's such an effective control and over yourself, over your own life, and over the lives of others, and that there's a lot of this balancing of who has what power and who has what control, and a lot of that comes from what information you have. And so I think in changing around these characters that have such different perspectives, at the same time that we're also kind of reckoning with being, especially as Jane and as Reagan, so uninformed and ill-informed. And so like it was really striking when a little over halfway through we stopped getting and this felt most striking in the conclusion, because I didn't notice immediately when a little over halfway we stopped getting Eight's perspective. But it's at that time when she stops writing from Eight's perspective that all of these uncertainties about Amalia and whether she's sick, and that Eight becomes unresponsive to Jane as well, and the way that she's like become kind of elusive to us as the reader. And so I think that the tension that is building within Jane's life and the anxiety around Amalia's safety and her well-being and all of these unknowns, that as a reader that felt so powerful and like so effective and intimate. I like so much of this book, I think what drove me through it so fast was the level of tension, which I think is so extraordinary, because it's not what I would consider like a suspenseful book. That's what I kind of said before. Like it's not in any way a mystery. Like we kind of know what we expect the outcome to be in some way, like that it is generally what would be considered such a controlled environment, and that the tension is really built from the emotions that are brought up within family dynamics and in relational dynamics and in how we process information and how we trust and who we trust, and how just our own relationships with others is so much of the driving influence in this. Because like what's going on is objectively insane. Like it's kind of crazy, but it's also kind of not. Like she does a really great job of taking something of making this feel real. And immediately what else comes to mind is Handmaid's Tale, that Atwood did so well, and that Atwood has very repeatedly, has repeatedly like stated that in her kind of speculative fiction dystopian works that she creates, that it's all like that it all comes from some kind of truth. Nothing is entirely constructed. So with Oryx and Crake and the Mad Adam series with Handmaid's Tale, that like what makes that book I think so striking and what gave it such a like cultural moment a few years ago is that its obscenity and like its the ways in which it achieves an extreme are still within the bounds and within the realms of like current possibility and within the world that already exists. And so I think that this does something really similar. And it also makes me think of Louise Erdrich's Future Homes of the Living God, or Future Home of the Living Gods, which was just like, I would love to read again. I think about a lot, but which also did such, like, in a really unique way, this kind of surveillance, and that these are really, like, that these works specifically focus on the surveillance of women, and specifically with The Farm and with Future Home of the Living Gods, the surveillance of pregnant women, and of surveillance and control as fundamentally good, like as necessary, that it invokes an additional kind of moral value of, in the perpetuation of the human race, are you doing good? And in our control of your body and our surveillance of your body, not only around pregnancy and abortion, but just in terms of like who is having children and how, and the power that can, I think the power of money and controlling bodies specifically for pregnancy, and for surrogacy and for raising children and having children, that's like a kind of has its own sort of microcosm of kind of questions and moral judgments that feels sort of distinct from the arguments that are the kind of conflicts that are, I think, most abundant, or at least most kind of that I observe most frequently, that's around the question of abortion and of fetus rights. And when are we getting beyond that too? And that it is all kind of within this sense of controlling a body for the well-being of a fetus. But when you introduce this element of wealth and of surrogacy and of power that extends beyond just an individual body, to kind of the sale of this body and the distribution of the body, not only as as producing, but as a kind of object in itself for service and for commerce and for consumerism. And that, this book is kind of making the argument that, or it's not really making an argument, and she has an author's note at the end that's kind of like, this really isn't intended to give answers. It's just a kind of observation of the way that of her world and the people that she knows, and the way, and the working immigrant women that she's connected with and talked with, who are in these positions of nanny and baby nurse and sitter. And I've working also in childcare and preschool and daycare I think it's just such a fascinating experience, and I think it really informs much larger relationships in the world, and spending so much of your time engaging with kids, I think it's just, yeah. And she's kind of bringing in all of these pieces of it. It also makes me think of, what is it called? Like White Teeth? White Fence? Oh God. It was another, I read it this year about blood-sucking toddlers. The blood-sucking toddlers, and the preschool teacher that was murdered, and the toddlers that started like drinking blood, and there's this question of like, how much is a mother specifically sacrificed, and a lot of this, and this as well, kind of how do all of these sort of questions of conflict and hierarchy between women, among women, within these systemic structures, sort of how much of that is sourced from the power system, the patriarchal power systems beyond it, that kind of in, I think especially the last chapter, the epilogue, where and the chapter right before that of Jane, when she's talking with May, and May kind of having this level of humanity that hasn't been absent the whole time. It comes up periodically, and it's kind of these glimpses of humanity in her cruelty, and of in Reagan's naivete, and within all of this obscenity, and you see in the ways that they sort of see themselves reflected within all of these other women, and that they all see themselves as doing good, that they're being good, they're being the good one, they're making the good decisions. And it's stated pretty explicitly by Jane too, when she finds the hospital room and sees that it's 8 that's sick and not Amalia, and realizing like that even the sale of her body as a commodity in the views of 8, in the eyes of 8, to whatever extent that's true, it's sourced from her desperation to care for Roy specifically, like all of her kids, but it's really clear, like it's her inability to be fully in control of him, that she is so accustomed to if she can behave correctly and respond correctly and manage everyone and make all of the right choices and make the decisions before it's if she can manipulate everything in the way that she imagines she can, that she can make everything work. And that in a lot of ways, at least from our perspective, it seems like she has, to the sense that she's amassed to some extent, like a significant amount of wealth, that she has these multiple properties, that she is giving money to her kids, to her family, that she goes on these jets and all of these like luxury experiences. And so even in, where we're kind of thrown through these characters, there's this kind of, I think part of what builds the tension as well, in shifting between all of these characters in this constantly like fluctuating sort of realm of knowledge and information, where we feel as a reader, we feel in the dark and uncertain, and suddenly we can't trust, and so we're waiting to get May's perspective. Is this true? Is what real? Can we trust what we see of her? That it like seems even that she lies to herself throughout, like that she has these conflicting ideas about what she wants to do and what matters to her and why she does it, like that there's all of this sort of contradiction throughout within these women. And you have 8 who appears in control all the time, and it's been revealed to us that she was scouting Jane and scouting Segundina, and that she what would appear malicious, especially when we're in the dark about how is Amalia, like we don't know how Amalia is. That's again this like ability to kind of create shadows in who we know and how much we know them, and also building skepticism in what do we trust and what can we trust when we haven't gone into their view and been able to kind of glean our knowledge and our understandings from that. And like there's so much that I think was just so well written, and I think there is this just dynamic feeling of tension among all of these women, and moments of, and that I think is, kind of similar to the experiences of these kind of irrational responses to things, these extreme emotions, and then there's kind of dismissing Jane's outbursts or Lisa's choices, Lisa's fucking, or like Reagan's sudden, insistence on donating her bonuses and what, like, that it's all sourced from emotion. And that when that perspective then shifts, when we're with Jane and she's making a decision, and like even at the very beginning, and she's like gets caught with her, like she's caught breastfeeding the kid that she nannies on accident, of through all of this, like, absurdity and things going wrong and this failure and this moment where you're like, you fucking idiot. Like, I felt frustrated of like, what are you doing? You fucked up here. And especially when you have 8 kind of, we have her perspective as well, and her sentiment of there's the right way to do things. And if you just follow these rules, you will get success. You will achieve success. You will achieve wealth. And you will remain in control of these things. And how foolish of her to be naive and to be young and to be trusting of people that she shouldn't trust. But I think that Ramos does such a phenomenal job of giving us both these insider and outsider perspectives, that we're having these dueling responses to, like, of course these things are getting fucked up for Jane. Like, she's doing the best she can in a shit show, and she's trying to care for her daughter, even though everyone kind of acts like, why would you care so much about caring for your daughter? But then everyone else, like, she's, surrounded by a bunch of liars and hypocrites, and who are talking about how she's a liar and a hypocrite. And of course, and she's suddenly having more and more information revealed to her. She can't really trust 8, and she doesn't know to what extent she can trust 8, and what's going on with Angel, and why is Angel lying for 8, and that this came from just the misunderstanding of they not wanting to worry her, but that level of isolation, and that they didn't, and that they believed so profusely 8 and Angel that they were acting in her best interest, and that they were helping her in the same way that they were kind of helping themselves. And so to that extent, even it almost feels difficult to, like, that there is this constant negotiation of like, how could you hate someone that's doing the best that she can for her kids and making the best decisions out of a bad decision, like among no good choices. And then also feeling like this kind of righteous indignation and frustration, this sense that they are responsible for the position, that Jane is responsible for being in this position because she fucked up here and she fucked up there, and if only she hadn't made these mistakes, like things would have worked out just fine. And ultimately, we know that that's not the case, that things work out. And that I think, like, that comes from May's compassion and also selfishness. And that it serves them both. It serves Jane and May, even as it infuriates Reagan. And you see Reagan kind of maintaining her righteousness, even like, when they're in a good mood, and they're in such a good mood, and the way that she writes, like, it's so, like, vibrant. The way that Ramos can, like, draw out such impactful shifts in mood and intention. Like, it was just so well written. And I think I was surprised by the long kind of jumps in time. It was also not what I expected. But I think that it like really served the novel well, as kind of additionally serving that even as a reader, that there's so much that we're missing. Even as we're getting multiple perspectives and we're getting these different ideas, that there's still these long swaths of time that we're misunderstanding, and suddenly, like, Jane is okay with Lisa again, but Lisa's actually leaving. Like things continue to unfold and unravel, even beyond our sight and beyond our understanding. And I think that it all just is so, like, the structure of it, I'm just so impressed by how its structure it so well facilitates the story as a whole, the way that it's organized. I just, like, was so gripping and consuming, and I think only enhanced all of kind of the emotional responses and the emotional ties that I felt to each of these characters. And as their moods shifted, and as their motivations shifted, and as they were grappling with the conflict of wealth versus goodness versus justice versus rightness versus like truth and reality, and it just all is so, like, masterfully conceived, so that every piece of it feels like it served a larger purpose of telling this story, and of telling multiple stories, which is really that there is no single story of this, and that there is no right answer, that even with whatever information we think is necessary, or believe we have, or we believe we know, or that these are the only resources we have, or this is, as much as we think we know, and as much as we think we understand, and as much as we believe that we are in control of the decisions that have such significant impact in our lives, in a lot of ways how little control we actually have, that that more than anything, it is navigating a host of what might be at best uncomfortable or unpleasant choices, and at worst, like, truly obscene. And that in a lot of ways the common experience is navigating this balance, not only in the physical sense of how we live in the world, but in how we participate in the world. Like, for Reagan, what's kind of brought up over and over again in her love for photography, and she wants to be a photographer, and also, like, how many extraordinarily rich people there are that want to believe that they are the exception of the harm of capitalism, is so that they want to reap the benefits of this wealth and distance themselves from, like, the culture of wealth. But I think a lot of that has to do also with a certain ego, maybe. I watched a video essay recently of what's the gay dude with the fun nails that he does a, like, whole thing. And I watched his video on Musk's rise, where he interviewed two people that authored a book about kind of, like, Musk's life and foray into politics, and how he's, like, arrived at this such a, like, powerful position in, like, the global political sphere. But it makes me think of, like, part of his obsession was of his rise is in part of what, has kind of allowed him to rise to this level, is one, like wealth and traveling wealth, and that within that he's kind of desperate to maintain a sort of contrarian position. And I think that's what we see with like how we get Trump, or these, that a lot of people identify with being an outsider. And in the same way that at the same time that there is the wealth inequality and the inequitable distribution of resources, and the extent to which the disparity in that, within that kind of wealth inequality, that in trying to identify ourselves within the other, we're sacrificing the distinction of that specific experience, or romanticizing it. That's the other thing that we see throughout this, are all of these kind of wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy, I think largely white people. We see it even with like Lisa's boyfriend Troy, who's this like good dude that wants to do the right thing, that's still like shoving his phone in Jane's face, is this obsession with kind of the perverse viewing of experiences of poverty and of tragedy, and that somehow we've constructed a reality in which the viewing of obscenity is equivocated with, I think, almost the experiencing of it. And I think that ties to this kind of element, this piece that centers around compassion and empathy, and how much it's almost like, to what extent can compassion or empathy negate harm? And if I can be righteous in my compassion and righteous in my care, that feeling is enough. And I think that a lot of that has to do with this kind of desperate need to assuage our own guilt in how we participate in systems of capitalism and in systems of inequality and inequitability, that it feels impossible to kind of distance ourselves, or like from these and this, I think, brings in sort of all these conversations around privilege, that now that we're aware that privilege exists, and now that we're becoming aware that it exists to different degrees, what do you do with that? How much should you do with that? What are the right ways to do something with that? I think it's a conversation that Reagan, I think, has with May in a lot of ways throughout the book. And that she's kind of sort of constantly trying to atone for the guilt that she feels about not experiencing suffering. And I think that this is a really relevant topic in conversation. I think that it's just among white communities and among men are really struggling, I have found, and I felt this in some ways, struggling to understand what does it mean to have privilege, and how does that impact not only how I experience the world, but then how I interact with others in the world. And what responsibility does someone hold having some degree of privilege? And I think that's where a lot of the resentment and the shame and the guilt comes in, is this kind of this pressure, whether it's something that is being placed on you or that's been kind of brewing from within, but a pressure to this sense of responsibility that feels both necessary and impossible to kind of fulfill or attain. And that's where, when you have like poor white people that have white privilege, but that are like economically disadvantaged, that this kind of question of privileged, this conflict regarding privilege seems to be more pronounced. Because how can you have privilege experiencing something bad? What does that mean? And that requires empathy, that requires compassion, to be able to identify that your experience is not unique and that is being experienced by someone else. But instead of, I think, it might be that, this kind of idea of like oppression Olympics, that there's a tendency to compete for our own suffering, and that again extends from this conflicting, dueling feeling of resentment and guilt, resentment and shame, the expectation that you have more power than you feel you actually hold, and that you act on a greater power than you feel that exists within you, that you have the expectation or the idea that if there is privilege and you are not in a position that you perceive as privileged, that your work is less valued, that your existence is less valued. I mean, and that's what we do. We tie morality to wealth. Poor people are don't try hard, don't make an effort. Then that's what we see within this, is all of these stereotypes of these there's extremely wealthy, largely white men and women saying that their Filipina servants are very hardworking and very quiet, but that they'll lie to you and that they make things up, and then that when given the other reflecting perspective, that we see that a woman lies to her boss so that she can go home to see family, because she wouldn't have been given the opportunity to go home if it were not for a more extreme. I mean, I think it's the way that like happens in at least how I've worked, of kind of that there's, and I think especially with capitalism and with the commodification of our labor, that there's a sense of how much of myself should I sacrifice for my work? How much do I sacrifice? And where is that boundary met? And so even in working in childcare, there's this question of how sick do I have to be before I'm allowed to stay home? Because morally, it's best for the kids if you're there. And we're understaffed, and so it's going to be much harder for your other coworkers if you're not there and you have to call in sick. And actually, there's these other people that are already on vacation, and so this is a bad week to come in sick. And I think that this is a really normal framing of how we think about work and sick days and being out, and when do we show up for our labor, and how much, and I think especially around illness and when working with kids who are they get you sick, you're getting more sick with them. It is physically hurting your body to do this work, and that the work itself will continue to demand more from your body than you can give. And so at what point do you determine that the work and the money is more valuable than your own body and then your own well-being? And then I think this book goes beyond that to say, when it's about your child. I'm doing this work as someone with no kids. And I've really learned these last few months how significant that autonomy is of being responsible only for my own physical well-being, how much more autonomy I have in the work that I do and how I think about and approach work. And when compared to the women that I worked with that are parents that have a kid or multiple kids or kids in their own daycare, and that in having others not only dependent on you, but I think Ramos shows us that emotion, like that intrinsic tie that is not necessarily better than everyone else, but the intrinsic tie that seems to exist between mother and child, physically, emotionally, mentally, that relationship and the creation of that relationship changes the boundaries of your own body. When your life and when your being extends beyond your physical body. I've talked about this kind of with my mom and this idea of motherhood. There's a couple other books. There was another one that I was thinking of that I think kind of, there's Big Little Lies, I think was one. Little Fires Everywhere. Kind of think the show was better, but I think a lot like that is, and even in I just finished our NRA and talking about bonobos, and even kind of thinking like evolutionarily, the link of that relationship, that physical tie. And it's partly, I think, it's genetic, right? And this kind of bringing up this question of it's just ongoing, but like, whose baby is it? If the baby is genetically a different sperm and a different egg, but is, given life by a surrogate, how much of that surrogate is the mother, is considered the mother? Is it, when we're thinking of this bond, I think as much as it is genetic, it's specifically kind of uniquely in the experience of surrogacy, it's also just that lived experience, and in a lot of ways lived trauma. I would consider, as someone who has not had kids, like that is how in a lot of ways it's perceived to me, is this kind of ongoing trauma to the body and the invasiveness of that. And that then going back to kind of these systemic sort of authorities like that in carrying a baby, that your body becomes so exposed to others, to the world. I mean, I even think of, just talked about maybe in a book or something, oh my God, might have been just in some collective of kind of what I've mentioned so far, but of like how invasive people are of pregnant women and pregnant people's bodies, that there's this kind of cultural perspective that a pregnant person's body is available for viewing, that it's now appropriate to touch, and to ask to touch a stranger's body, in a way that's so, to ask them really intimate, personal questions, to interact with their body, that is normalized. Like all of these ways, I think, in which the experience of being pregnant and of carrying a baby, and then kind of the trauma of giving birth, and I have all kinds of ideas about that, of course I do. That forms a bond between mother and infant, even when that genetic connection is lacking. I do think that that's part of this. And that it's, as much as it is the experience of kind of being intruded upon, something like that, as a pregnant person, I also think it's worth considering, like, how us as people in the world, as non-pregnant people, how kind of our relationship to a stranger's body shifts when it is different, when it is a pregnant person's body. Like, that the way that creates a shift mentally and emotionally of how we interact with that person. And that a lot of that is kind of driven by this sort of objectification of pregnant women and of pregnant bodies. And that only becomes more and more so as, like, surrogacy becomes more popular, and as alternative forms of pregnancy, I think, rise, of freezing eggs and as like technological advancements enable shifting relationships to pregnancy. I think that there's a kind of, I think part of it is that, you know, the flip side of having a farm of the poor women who are outsourcing their bodies as surrogates to make money, is that it's framed as giving women the opportunity to have it all. That you can be a mother and a wealthy, successful businesswoman, and you can jet all over the world, and you can have 3 kids in a habit, like that the women using this service are kind of being sold freedom. The idea is that they're being sold freedom. They're being sold access to another person's body, so that they can retain autonomy. That in maintaining their own autonomy and sense of power, and self-control, that they are able to accomplish this through the commodification of someone else's body. And that this commodification is perceived as being like a benefit, here's an opportunity that this woman would otherwise not have had. Jane working for Miss U at the end, in some ways is best case scenario, which feels obscene because we see that that's not best case scenario. We see that women can achieve all of these extraordinary things if they just work hard. So how is it that Jane could settle, kind of Reagan's perspective, how is it that Jane could settle for this job as Miss U's live-in nanny? And I think part of it is kind of the framing of what does it mean to have choice, that she has choice to some extent, and that her choice is controlled by money. So she needs money, and what is essentially the most, how can she get money and care for her child? And here's a woman who, through her own sense of kind of guilt in a lot of ways, both guilt and compassion, perceives herself in a positive light as providing Jane, May is providing Jane a home and an opportunity to care for her child and to be with her child and to raise her and to not be jumping around jobs and to have a space of her own. Like, here is a successful woman who believes herself to be generously offering her wealth and sharing it to someone else that needs it. And so isn't that good? And Jane is is quite reasonably like, yeah, it is good. Fuck you, Reagan. Like, there are not endless options. And, which kind of intersects with this concept around like morality and righteousness more generally, of who is it that even does it require a certain privilege to maintain your righteousness? Could Lisa only be as angry and bitchy as she was and righteous and could recognize all of the fuck ups of the farm because she had amassed a degree of power? And so in having power, she can recognize and name these things that are wrong. I mean, that feels like the whole book. I just spent an hour talking about shit just to get to that one point. It's like, yeah, duh. And that's the thing, too. Like, even I'm probably just talking about something for an hour. By the time I get to the end, I'm like, well, duh, of course. So maybe I've just made my own argument. I just thought it was, so phenomenal. I'll be thinking about it a lot. Oh my God, it also makes me think of a James Tiptree Jr., one of her most famous short stories, which of course, once again, I can't remember, but it's of the two women that like go to the island and kind of steal the men, or they like manipulate the men and then they're taken away by aliens, and the men are like, what are you doing? And they're like, it's better than the other options. Like, that I think that there's that it is a kind of like, you do what you can and you find your best option. And that in a lot of ways, those being most critical, not only of the systems, but of people making decisions within those systems that do not align with kind of the morally superior and more like influential and powerful people. I just lost what I was saying. Yeah, but it is kind of like it's complicated. It's fucking complicated. And that the people being critical are also those that are not only maintaining it and perpetuating it, and benefiting from it, but not making an effort to change it. And I think that is the piece of it too, is how, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot, is how one of, I think moving beyond, I think for me, part of this practice that I'm continuing to kind of figure out and work on is how to move beyond, not only, there's identifying privilege. What does that mean and where does it exist? And how does that actually impact my life? And then there's feeling empathy and compassion for people that have experiences different. Like, this is like, what are the levels of like, how do we not only live in, and participate in, but enact a more just society. So at first there's this level of self-awareness, and then it's empathy and compassion and connecting with others. And kind of in Reagan, this whole but I can see, doesn't matter that I see, that I take these pictures, that you can see what's angry, and that you'll look at it and that it'll make you angry. Now you've had this feeling. Now you've connected with someone else. And I think part of this process for me of not getting stuck in this kind of egocentric way of thinking about justice and injustice, inequality, and inequitability is, there's compassion and empathy, then there's action, then there's the things you actually do. There's Miss You believing that she is giving a home and resources and wealth to Jane. She is helping her live she is giving her a better life, giving her the opportunity to give Amalia a life of greater financial security and influence in the world. And I think beyond that is then, what do you sacrifice? Here are all of the ways that I've expanded and I've grown and I've connected. And even to the extent that we give, that we are generous, that we are philanthropic, that level of philanthropy, in a lot of ways, that generosity exists beyond sort of, I think, an individual, maybe comfort level, almost just like the kind of, what do I believe I deserve? When you have achieved more than you need, specifically in wealth, in resources, in material goods, in material needs, in time, when you are able to share with others and provide for others, this is what capitalism is trying to negotiate. How much of yourself do you give? Do you sacrifice parts of yourself, and how much and for who? I think that's what we see a lot with 8's character, and where Jane's anger and anxiety as her communication with 8 diminishes and disappears is this distrust. I lost what I was thinking about again. Oh, of course I did. Also, I just keep thinking about just the fact that 8 is called 8 in the whole book. That's not her name. Her name is Evelyn. 8 is it a term for like older sister or older cousin? That she is kind of fun. She is framed in this book completely, not really as her own name, but as a caretaker. And that is her whole life. And she regards that position as having given her some control in her life. And so she holds on to that so tightly. I think is just, again, like that's just another fantastic, I think, literary choice that's really effective in how I at least perceived Eight's character was always through this lens of caretaker. And in being a caretaker, kind of all of the sort of expectations that come along with that, of being prepared, of being vigilant and diligent, and a kind of expert, which is how she positions herself, how she perceives herself, and so it's how we are made to perceive her. And then eventually we're kind of faced with this like in making that her being, and that she did it as a means to grow, partly for herself, but largely for her kids, and her primary motivation being Roy. I'm just rambling now. I don't know. I don't fucking know. I don't know. I'm just rambling. It is so good. It is so good. Yeah. I'm loving. I really appreciate these like motherhood, pregnancy, dystopian perspectives. I'm trying to think if there's any, but I think that those are the, like, Handmaid's Tale. I think I've been writing about this too. I think I have a like folder with a bunch of like papers and books and resources that kind of all go back to this. I mean, partly as motherhood and pregnancy, but also like just the arching question of autonomy, and how does autonomy fit into capitalism, and how do kind of our current capitalist systems that value profit and product and more our bodies as both profit and product, both in the sense of the surrogates and the women moguls using these surrogates, because they believe their body does not have the time and the capacities within the frame of her life to undergo all of the stress and change and unpredictability. Yeah. Awesome. We're starting off the new year on a good book. Good book. And this is her only book, 2019. I went and looked at her Instagram. She's working on another book, I think, but nothing yet. But I really look forward to whatever else she writes. I just think that it was great. It just, I could probably talk about it for like I'm sure there's all different kinds of pieces of it that I was thinking about the whole time that I didn't even kind of touch on. Like it's so good. So good. Hallelujah. A good random book. I knew. It called to me.